countries of Asia do not always have developed bond markets or offer safe, quote unquote, safe enough financial instruments, so more often than not, their savings are invested in low return treasury securities of rich countries. This asymmetry is reflected in the paradoxical fact that the dollar is often regarded as the only safe currency in times of crisis, even when the crisis itself is caused by reckless activities in the US. I also think Roderick underemphasizes some of the cases of heightened need for global coordination, where too much national diversity of policies and standards can cause problems all around. And I'm going to give you some examples. And in fact, most of my examples will not be from the finance side, from other aspects of global governance. First, the obvious case of global public goods with externalities of domestic policies. Global climate, of course, is a major issue that Vinod has emphasized in the morning. Ocean fisheries, afflicted not merely by overfishing, but by carbonization, which is also related to the global warming issue. These are obvious cases of global public goods, where national policy diversity is not enough. Second example, cases of what economists would call pecuniary externalities. You see, externalities are where markets fail. You cannot, there's a asymmetry between social and private. A market cannot resolve it, so you have to have some policy intervention. Pecuniary externalities where the spillover effect, the externality, works through the market. For example, at the smallest sign of food scarcity, some large countries, including some in BRIC, have a tendency to ban food exports, feeding the speculative frenzy and rampant hoarding and pushing up international food prices, causing enormous misery to the world's poor. International rules and information sharing should try to mitigate this, and resources should be pooled to utilize and strengthen the management services of the World Food Programme in emergency food reserve holding and distribution. So this is an example in which the externalities work through the market prices and of course sometimes causing havoc to the world food distribution. Third example, developing countries should take a united stand for rules against concentration of international economic power which allocate the lion's share of the gains from trade to the giant global companies. In fact, I may make a digression here. We've been talking about Chinese exports, etc. Many of these products which are made in China, if you look at how much goes to China, you'll be surprised. Even if you take simple products, like say in the United States, you walk into Walmart, you pick up a little doll, the Barbie doll, which sells for about $9.99. At the back of it says made in China. I've seen a study which shows out of this $10, Chinese workers get 65 cents. And about 35 cents is the cost of the materials. So altogether it's $1. Then the Hong Kong seller takes about $1 more, $2. By the time it leaves mainland China, only $2. It sells for $10. Of course there's transportation cost, there's advertisement cost, distribution cost, but it cannot be $8 out of 10. So you can see the huge margin the retail companies and the global multinationals are keeping. And there's enormous international economic power concentration. I'll give you my example. The example that I just gave you is from a toy. But let me give you an example from international agribusiness. In recent years, through mergers, acquisitions, and business alliances, the agri-food corporations have concentrated enormous market power. Companies like Monsanto, Cargill, Nestle, and Walmart have come to dominate supply chains for food and agricultural goods from all the way from seeds and pesticides to the supermarket shelf final products. There are some who believe in the need for an international agreement on trade-related antitrust principles. Maybe you should call it traps. Judging and ruling against international restrictive business practices. You might say, who is going to enforce this? There is at least a need for an international antitrust investigation agency. Even if such an agency may not have much enforcement powers, internationally publicized reports of antitrust investigations by a recognized international body will have some impact on giant monopolies and strengthen the hands of domestic competition commissions in developing countries. After all, the Basel Committee on Banking Regulations has no enforcement powers either. Next example. The principle of national autonomy should not be allowed to violate certain minimum universal standards and basic human rights. Take, for example, some of the core labor standards specified by the ILO. Specified by the ILO, particularly those against slave or forced labor or extreme forms of child labor, even if these are voluntarily supplied by the worker in a poor country. Even beyond the core ILO labor standards, there should be restrictions on international trade of goods produced in unsafe working conditions or hazardous occupations. The downside of national autonomy is that the domestic economic policy process can also be captured by powerful domestic lobbies. Binding commitments to external rules can sometimes loosen the grip of these lobbies. In Europe, some of the domestic protectionist farm lobbies hide under the unrealistic safety and sanitary standards imposed on food exports of developing countries. So let me conclude. Many nations are unlikely to agree to some of these principles of global governance. It is difficult but important to strike the right balance between national policy autonomy and global rules, and to work out a broad band of agreed international rules within which national policies can have some leeway. So this is the balance in the title, the need for balance in the title of the paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And our last speaker is Mohan Guruswamy from India Center for Policy Alternatives.
Right. Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you very much to the organizers of this conference who kind enough not only to invite just one from my center, but two of us from our center, and we are glad to be here. And you know, it's a superbly organized conference. Congratulations to all of you. And we have a saying in India that when you have two Indians in a room, they are argumentative people, and they form three political parties and four religions. We have three Indians sitting on this. So you can imagine the ideological chaos which is coming out of this. In the global context, economic and political reform are interlinked and intertwined. You can't separate them. In 2001, when President Clinton handed over to George Bush, he left a reasonably healthy budget and a healthy trade situation. The U.S. economy was first time on even keel. And then President Bush came, and he went to 2 wars at the same time. He didn't take the world's permission. He didn't even bother asking the UN. And they went into war. And he borrowed money. The Chinese were quite happy to lend money to finance the war. And he financed the war and left the US in a deep hole, and the world in a deep hole, without anybody's consent. I won't say anything more about this now. Now we have the recent events in the IMF. The chairman of the IMF is sitting in a prison cell in Rikers Island. But the IMF is not coming to the rest of the world for a new chairman, for a new director. They're looking among themselves in Europe. So there's a consensus here that the IBRD will have somebody from America, the IMF will have somebody from Europe, and they will continue to manage the world in the way they're doing. And the IMF has always had a fixed prescription for the world. If countries like India had went into a spiral, they had very fixed prescriptions, convertibility, revalue the rupee, and devalue the rupee, and austerity measures. But they have no prescriptions for themselves. The United States is a prime example of a basket economy. And that is the truth. But the IMF has no word for the United States. And the IMF is looking for little ways of balancing the European economies with more funding, but no stringent norms, like the norms which hit Argentina, Brazil, India, and all other developing countries in the past. But we're now living in a highly intertwined world. All crises are contagious. Something could happen in Greece. It could have an after effect in Indonesia or Polynesia or God knows where. And so, global governance issues, they are mostly related to use of power, how the world power structure is put together. As I said earlier, the United States didn't have a mandate for Iraq, yet it went there. NATO had a mandate in Libya for a no-fly zone, but then that mandate has taken it to, shooting up half of Libya, including Gaddafi's home. And the IMF so far, even after all these years, has not spoken a single word to the United States about reforming itself. For that matter, when the United States abolished the gold standard in Nixon's time, they didn't talk to the world about it. They just decided that, we're going to do it. So clearly there's a set of rules for them and a set of rules for us. And this is the issue we're grappling with, which is why I call my topic the alphabet soup. The alphabet soup was something which President Roosevelt had during the Great Depression, when they were giving away soup to children. They made spaghetti in the form of alphabets so that the kids could play with them while eat them. So, it was become a good idea by the Campbell Soup Company, but they sold it as, a public good. So we had the alphabet soup. So now we're trying to grapple with this, and we've come up with a whole bunch of alphabet soup, BRICS, RICS, IPSA, GIPSA, BASIC.